Welcome back to Art History at Pasadena City College. I'm Professor Wells. Well, we're beginning our unit on Mesopotamia. And that will take you to a region of the world that you're very familiar with. I'll show you a couple maps in a few minutes. But it's really a region that's known as the cradle of civilization. It's where we started to meet those settled communities in the Neolithic world of the Stone Age, where there wasn't this hunter-gatherer mentality anymore, where people were moving to, find their food or escape harsh weather conditions associated with the Ice Age. Finally, we're embarking on an era where the Ice Age is diminishing, and these populations that form these small communities, like Jericho, are now going to be growing by leaps and bounds. And where, again, there's food, no need to hunt and gather, as well as a fertile region in which to settle, populations grow. You have an incredible labor force, and the arts have an opportunity to flourish as well. So let's get to our PowerPoint, and I'll introduce you to our first group in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians. The Sumerians were very innovative in many ways, and we'll continue in this unit meeting other successive civilizations and cultures in that region that came after them, looking at about 3,000 years of history. But first, back to the Sumerians, which takes us about 5,000 years ago. All right, moving to my PowerPoint here. I'm going to minimize myself and get those slides up for your enjoyment and information. All right, here. Very good. Moving on to the art of Mesopotamia here. What we find, as I mentioned, is this region is really associated with the real birthplace of civilization. But what I mean is not just these settled communities, but we're going to start to see with the Sumerians the development of city-states with forms of government, religion. We'll see that through the arts in particular here. Moving on to our next slide. Here's a map as promised. I love a good map, gives you a sense of where we've been. This is something we looked at a little bit associated with the Neolithic worlds, associated with Jericho down here in Chatal-Garuk. But this is the region we'll be focusing a lot of our attention in. And it's significant because of these two iconic rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that flow through present-day Iraq. Much like what we'll see when we get into Egyptian art history, a very important, factor for settled communities is the source of water. And then with rivers, the flooding of the banks, they bring nutrients and fertile soil so that agriculture and animal husbandry flourish as well. But right where you see this word Sumer, this is the region we're going to talk about some of the developments in the Sumerian culture, our first Mesopotamian culture that we'll be looking at in civilization. So think Mesopotamia is a region, really. It's a regional reference, like SoCal is here in Southern California, but it is not a culture in and of itself. Mesopotamia is home to all of these civilizations and cultures that we'll be examining in this particular unit. Just to overlay here a second, more contemporary or modern map, just to give you a sense of geography. Here are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers on this map, running through, as you can recognize now, the more familiar delineation of the countries of Iraq, Iran, Syria, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. So this is why, tumultuous history of Iraq, has been really hard on, preservationists, people who, value the important legacy of that region to the story of mankind, incredible developments, and particularly in regard to art history. All right, so as I mentioned, the region Mesopotamia known for a succession of these city-states. And again, we're looking approximately from the years 3500 to 500 BCE. Just rounding it off for you, nice and friendly. We'll start out with this video lecture getting into the Sumerians and the city-states of Ur and Uruk. And then later you'll find in this unit, we'll have content pages and links in Canvas that will talk about the Akkadians, the Neo-Sumerians, and the Babylonians. I'll return with another series of video lectures about the Assyrians, and then this unit on Mesopotamia will conclude with the Persians, particularly with their magnificent kind of palatial capital citadel of Persepolis. All right, just as a quick introduction here, what you may have heard of as the earliest form of writing is known as cuneiform. And cuneiform is something that is credited with the Sumerian civilization. So you find now we have these, increasingly large city-states and more of an organized society. You finally discovered, they finally evolved into writing, and they use clay tablets like you see on the photo on the side here in a wedge-shaped instrument or stylus that you can see here, and some others efforts in the past have been able to translate what cuneiform is telling us. But practically speaking, you find a lot of these tablets, if they are discovered intact, and again, clay tablets, you can imagine how difficult it is to find clay that survived the millennia. But they often are very practically used, describing things like tracking inventories, crops and other items for trade, that kind of thing. Okay, so we have writing, but what's also really fascinating is that we have evidence of storytelling. And so what you find here, I'm going to make myself disappear for just a minute, is you have stories from the imagination. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. I had a low battery message that you might have seen. I just plugged in my monitor. Okay, the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Tale of Gilgamesh, is an ancient story. It's one of the oldest stories that's been discovered because of a remnant of it being told in cuneiform on clay tablets, and again, to the Sumerians' credit. So like us, the Sumerians were into stories of heroes and monsters, kings who are monster slayers, that kind of thing. That's why we love going to the movies and grabbing a big bucket of popcorn. That's exactly what I like to pay that admission to see. And so you find in the ancient world, they're not too dissimilar to what we find entertaining as well. All right, popping myself back into your view here. Okay, this is something I just wanted to show you, a smattering of photos. A large part of the discovery in the region has to do with the colonial presence. The British were heavy in that region, and their passion for archaeology not only led to the discovery of incredible finds in Egypt, but very much so in Mesopotamia, particularly in Iraq, when the royal tombs of a king and queen were discovered. And you can see in the large photo above one of the historic archaeological digs going on during that time. And it was back in the 20s when this happened, and it's there they discovered some 1,800 graves, if you can believe that, associated with his royal cemetery. Some of the goods found included this gold headdress. What it sits on is kind of a black, kind of like a mannequin, stylized mannequin's head that you see here, but you can make out how it would cross the queen's brow, because it was meant for a queen, Queen Puabi. Puabi, Queen Puabi, and it has this sort of decorative ornamentation on the top. It also kind of drapes down around the ears. But that tells you this luxury object, this precious material of gold, it bespeaks to the wealth of the Sumerian world, but also that their society was organized, that they were ruled by a monarchy, a king and a queen, and other luxury objects we'll take a look at as we move forward in our unit on the Sumerians. So this was, illuminated a lot about their culture and their world. By the way, when Queen Puabi was buried, they also discovered the remains of 5 soldiers and 23 maids who apparently poisoned themselves to be her staff in the afterlife. I know, right? Pretty gruesome. Anyway, let's move on to Sumerian architecture, because this is something that flew under the radar for quite a while as evidence of these buildings called ziggurats. Literally disappeared in the sands of time, and a lot of that has to do with the building material they were using. So a ziggurat is an example of a sacred or temple architecture. It's built of mud bricks. There aren't really sources of stone in Iraq, so what you find is construction. Things that needed to be built were often done so with mud bricks, which you can see the problem over time with weather and age, not such an enduring material. What you find also characteristic of ziggurats are these axial stairways, and I'll show you some diagrams in a minute. And then also you find on the very top a temple. So the ziggurat is made up of this sloped platform. So you can see here this almost trapezoidal-like shape that would elevate in the temple on the very top. And it's there from this temple that only Sumerian priests and maybe the king or queen would be allowed to enter that sanctuary. And there would be a room called a waiting room. And just like the waiting room at your doctor's office, you would stand by, and they believed that their god or deities, and they had several, would descend and interact with them, and then the priests or the high officials, the rulers, would pass on those messages to the people at large. So it was not something, the admission was not granted to the average Sumerian citizen. Again, it was an exclusive experience to the most high-ranking religious or government officials associated with the Sumerian world could go into this temple here. But this is the beginning of talking a lot about religious architecture. We're going to be talking about height from this point forward all the way to the end of our unit with Gothic Europe. The idea of building something, tall, large, reaching to the heavens, right? The idea of connecting to the divine, to heaven. That's a very ancient world approach to religion. All right, I have a couple minutes here in my time. Let me introduce you here to the White Temple in Ziggurat in Uruk, dating 3200 to 3000 BCE. Now, looking at this photo, it's hard to recognize that as anything extraordinary. That looks like the many kind of decomposing granite hills and mountains, and you take that route to Vegas, to the California desert. It doesn't, it looks like a natural kind of landmass. But moving on to this slide here, we can see that it was originally forming the base of that sloped ziggurat. This is a bird's eye view, meaning we're looking down from above of that ziggurat, and here is this temple here. So when I come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the White Temple in Ziggurat, the approach to it, what an artist's rendering of it looks like, and then we'll look at one more example of a ziggurat before we move on to take a look at our first Sumerian sculpture, And I have another form of Sumerian artwork as well that's going to tell you a little bit about their approach to war and peace.